The world is divided into 4 spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Lines. Hello and welcome to Imaginary Lines. I'm your host, Michael Fox. Today we bring you a special end-of-the-year episode including some of our best media analysis over the last year. We'll be showcasing stories on Black Lives Matter, the Paris attacks, CIA involvement in Syria, Venezuela-Colombia border issues, opposition violence in Ecuador, and state violence against journalists in Mexico. Enjoy. Justice now! Whose voice matters? This is an important question in journalism, where police officers and officials are quoted while the voices of the people are ignored or forgotten, particularly when they don't fit the mainstream narrative. This is the case of the coverage of the police killing of 17-year-old black teen Laquan McDonald in Chicago. It's also the reality in the news from another shooting in Minneapolis. On the evening of Monday, November 23rd, 5 Black Lives Matter activists demonstrating against police brutality were shot by a group of white supremacists. The attack came a week after sustained protests outside the Minneapolis Police Department over the shooting of unarmed Jamar Clark by 2 police officers. An article by CNN, however, failed to quote any of the Black Lives Matter protesters in their coverage, let alone investigate the police failure to protect their lives after the activists had reported previous threats by white supremacists. Here's what you would have heard.
Despite earlier statements from police about the impending threat from white supremacists, the police instead maced citizen journalists and peaceful protesters. We reiterate that we have zero faith in this police department's desire to keep our communities safe.
Instead, CNN turned the police into heroes. The exercise was repeated across media coverage of the event, where the victims' voices were either silenced or minimized, and the statements from authorities such as the police and politicians highlighted.
We are sparing no efforts to find the suspects and to bring them to justice.
In this case, the problem is even more severe, with the very institution that the activists are protesting for police brutality being highlighted as the heroes and the voice of truth. This practice, rehearsed daily by the media, makes it hard to see where the violence of the police ends and the mainstream press begins. As it stands, neither seem to actually believe that black lives really do matter. The recent horrific attacks in Paris shook the world, but also served to highlight how some tragedies seemingly count more than others. Headline after headline claimed that the death count amounted to the worst attack in France since World War II. The Daily Beast, Paris wakes up under siege after deadliest attack since World War II. And Yahoo News, 120 dead in Paris attacks, worse since World War II. While the events in Paris were indeed horrific, they weren't the worst violence in France since World War II. They weren't even the worst violence in Paris. On October 17, 1961, French police violently dispersed the rally in support of Algeria's independence movement, the FLN. Police opened fire with live ammunition on a peaceful crowd packed mostly with Algerian immigrant families, including children. As the rally collapsed, police chased fleeing Algerians through the streets, beating them to death with clubs. In the aftermath of the massacre, bodies were dumped into the same river. Around 11,000 survivors were rounded up and detained. In the subsequent days, many of the detainees were beaten and deprived of food. The French government long claimed just a handful of protesters died, but historians believe as many as 300 may have been killed. Unlike the latest massacre in Paris, little is known of the 1961 killings. Even in France, the details of the massacre were long swept under the carpet. When comparing reactions to the 1961 and 2015 massacres, it's hard to ignore a few basic facts. One tragedy was about the West being attacked. The other was about an assault on Arabs. One massacre stopped the world, while the other remains almost completely forgotten. Russia's recent pledge of support for Syria has been all over the US news lately, as have reports on Obama's, quote, failed Syrian policy. But something has been left out. 2 weeks ago, the US media watchdog group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, published an article by contributing writer Adam Johnson, highlighting that recent mainstream coverage has completely ignored the well-documented US clandestine activities in Syria. The reality is this: As Johnson writes, according to multiple reports over the last 3.5 years, we know that the CIA set up secret programs for arming, funding, and training forces against the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. This has been reported by major outlets including the New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, and The Washington Post. The latter even detailed a program that trained roughly 10,000 fighters at a cost of $1 billion per year, or roughly 1/15 of the CIA's official annual budget. The impression in the media, writes Johnson, is that the U.S. has sat idly by while foreign states such as Iran and Russia have interfered in Syria's internal conflict. An idle U.S. is certainly not what folks on the ground in Syria see. And while U.S. government agencies can't acknowledge clandestine CIA operations, the media should do its best not to ignore the past and let history be rewritten.
Con esta aprobación, la Asamblea Nacional da un respaldo irrestricto a la lucha que libra el Gobierno Nacional contra los fenómenos como el paramilitarismo, narcotráfico y contrabando de extracción que atentan contra el pueblo venezolano.
On August 21st, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro declared a state of exception in response to violence perpetrated by paramilitary groups in the border region with Colombia.
Una realidad espantosa de cómo se ha posicionado el delito, la criminalidad, la economía criminal, el paramilitarismo en toda esta región de Venezuela. Yo estoy obligado a defender a Venezuela, a liberar a Venezuela de todo esto.
This is the first time a state of exception has been implemented since the approval of the 1999 Venezuelan Constitution. The state of exception differs from a state of emergency in that human rights are still guaranteed. Unfortunately, many news organizations have erroneously conflated the two, either out of ignorance or an effort to smear the Venezuelan government.
Los colombianos están escondidos y se protegen ante los operativos de la Guardia Venezolana, como en los tiempos bíblicos cuando Herodes buscaba a los niños o la persecución de los judíos en el siglo pasado.
Venezuela is dealing with a serious threat posed by paramilitary groups that are not only disposed to using violence, as was evidenced by the recent attack on Venezuelan soldiers, but are involved in complex operations such as smuggling, extortion, and drug trafficking. The government also alleges that members of the political opposition are cooperating with the paramilitaries. But instead of reporting on the gravity of this situation, many media outlets have opted to tarnish Venezuela, accusing the government of seeking a scapegoat and criticizing the deportations of undocumented Colombians living in Venezuela. Corporate media has continued to criticize Venezuela for its shaky economy, yet the closure of the border with Colombia has revealed just how much of an impact the smuggling of cheap goods into Colombia has on shortages in Venezuela. Of course, this went largely unmentioned in most media. The term paramilitary failed to appear at all in many articles, though when it comes to coverage of Venezuela, deliberate omission and manipulation are par for the course. On August 13th, segments of the indigenous movement in Ecuador, together with opposition-aligned trade unions and politicians, staged protests against the government of Rafael Correa. After the sun went down, the demonstrations turned violent. Protesters attacked police with sticks, rocks, poles, and firebombs as they tried to break past a police barricade to reach Quito's Plaza Grande, where a rally of government supporters was being held in front of the presidential palace.
En una democracia, todos tienen derecho a manifestarse, a protestar si se están conculcando sus derechos. Pero ¿qué derechos se están conculcando aquí? Por el contrario, están atentando contra el derecho de las grandes mayorías, al cerrar los carreteros, al amenazar con aislarnos. ¿Por qué? Porque no seguimos lo que ellos dicen, lo que ellos quieren, sus caprichos.
Story after story, media outlets distorted the news. The number of protesters in the march, or downplayed the violence that left over 80 police officers injured. Some news agencies claimed the strike paralyzed public transportation, or insinuated that it was a massive uprising by the country's people, though an overwhelming majority of Ecuadorians rejected the protests. Sure enough, in the days after the opposition protest, there were denunciations of the so-called repression and accusations that President Correa's government is creeping toward dictatorship. If this script sounds familiar, that's because you've heard it before. Any government that dares to challenge the neoliberal order is seen as a threat, and powerful people conspire against it. In past decades, they would have responded with a military coup. These days, powerful individuals and entities know that the people will not tolerate a coup attempt. Instead, these groups turn to smear campaigns in an effort to paint a false picture. Before making assumptions, we should be vigilant to be sure that the news we are receiving is an adequate portrayal of the actual realities on the ground.
¡Porque vivos se los llevaron! ¡Vivos los queremos! ¡Porque vivos se los llevaron! ¡Vivos los queremos!
As mobilizations have grown over the last year, demanding the safe return of the forcibly disappeared 43 students from Ayotzinapa, one slogan was heard repeatedly. That slogan, "Fue el Estado," it was the state, captured the sentiment of millions who knew that the disappearance of these students was not the result of everyday criminals, but rather the Mexican state was responsible. After news broke recently of the murder of photojournalist Ruben Espinosa, activist Nadia Vera, and 3 others in their apartment in Mexico City, anger and frustration has reached a breaking point. Colleagues and activists have been quick to once again pin the blame on the state. The slogan, "It was the state," re-emerged, but transformed into "It is the state." Media outlets have erred in their coverage by highlighting the fact that some journalists are seeking greater guarantees of security from the state. What in fact is happening is that most journalists are calling for the state itself to stop killing them. Mexico is descending further and further into a black hole of impunity. The lines between organized crime and government officials have become ever more blurred. Should news emerge of yet another Mexican journalist killed for exercising his or her profession, media outlets the world over should join in the condemnations so that the international community is clear on one issue, that it is the state. And that's it for today's program. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Michael Fox. Please join me next week.